Space. Outer space is cool, NASA is cool, the Hubble Space Telescope is cool, and photos of nebulas are most definitely cool. I'm Simon Jones from HitFilm.com, and in this tutorial I'll be showing you how to make this epic 3D shot of the stellar spire in the Eagle Nebula, using nothing more than a public domain image from NASA and HitFilm. Okay, let's break it down. It all started with a still image, specifically this one, which is titled "The Eagle Has Risen." I'll give you details of where to get images like this in just a moment. Using techniques I covered in an earlier tutorial, I took the 2D image and split it into several sections, creating a scene in 3D space. This creates a sense of depth when the camera is moved. 2 genuine particle clouds were added that would envelop the whole scene and give it some atmosphere, and a bunch of space dust was added to help make the camera movement more obvious. Finally, a couple of light flare stars were added, and the shot was graded to look richer and more realistic. I turned to NASA and the Space Telescope Science Institute, who run an amazing website at hubblesite.org, where you'll find an enormous collection of photographs taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. The best thing is that most of the images are in the public domain, so you can use them in your projects however you want. We've included the Eagle Has Risen image with the tutorial files, which you can download from hitfilm.com/files/nebula.zip. I do highly recommend you head over to hubblesite.org and check out their galleries though, because they're super spiffy. Once you've downloaded the tutorial files, unzip them and open up the project file in HitFilm. You'll find the completed shot in the Nebula Final composite shot. For this tutorial, we're going to start from scratch. First off, let's make a new comp from the new menu in the media panel. We'll go for a standard 720p setup. We can now add our nebula image to the timeline. The image is oriented to portrait, so let's rotate it by 90 degrees so that it is more of a widescreen ratio. I'll also switch it to 3D using the menu down here on the timeline, which also automatically adds a camera. I'm going to split my viewer into 2 views now, which will make it a little easier to see what's going on. If you're using HitFilm Ultimate, you can do the same. In HitFilm Standard, you'll have to switch between the perspective and active camera views. We'll show the perspective view on the right and keep the active camera on the left. With the image layer selected, I'll now push it back in Z space so that it recedes into the distance. Because it's now further away, the image can be enlarged somewhat to make sure it fills the frame. The easiest way to do this is to grab one of the corner points and just drag it straight out. By tapping F2 with the layer selected, I can now rename it. Because I'm incredibly imaginative, I'll call it Background. Next up, I'll press Ctrl and D, which is the keyboard shortcut to duplicate a layer. We've now got 2 layers called Background. This one I'll rename to Midground. It's currently in exactly the same place as the original, so let's grab it and move it back towards the camera. Because it's closer, due to perspective it now appears larger in the frame. Let's shrink it back down so that we can see the whole thing. We now want to mask this layer to get rid of everything except the main spire. This is done by selecting the layer, then activating the freehand mask tool and drawing around the shape. We can keep it fairly loose. Once we're done, I'll increase the feather so that the mask has a soft edge. The background layer is now visible behind the midground. If we select the orbit control and move the camera around, you can see that there's already a sense of depth to the scene. Alright, here we are a few minutes later, having added additional layers using that same technique. There are now 4 layers based on the original 2D image, so that we have a lot of subtle parallax in the movement. The background image is so large that it's a little too obvious that it's just a flat image. This can be avoided with the use of a fisheye effect, which gives the image a concave look that looks more natural to the lens. The amount property should be set to -93 to give it the right kind of warp. Converting a 2D image to fake 3D in this manner can work nicely, but there's no getting around the fact that it's still just a mixture of flat planes. To hide this fact and give the shot some genuine 3D depth, we're going to use one of HitFilm's 3D weather effects in a rather unusual way. The fluffy cloud effect is intended to be used in landscape shots, but it will work very nicely here as a space nebula. It can be simply dropped onto the timeline, enlarged using the scale transform property, and then moved into position to cover the image layers. You can see that I've positioned it to sit slightly off to the left. As you can see, because HitFilm's particles exist in the same 3D scene as your layers, it's giving a real sense of depth, with the images that are farther away being more obscured by the cloud. To set the colour, I'll first turn off the cloud so that I can see the rest of the scene. Then click and hold on the pipette icon and select the mauve kind of colour around this part of the nebula. If I now turn the cloud back on, you can see that the colour nicely matches that of the nebula, so you can't really tell where the cloud ends and the image begins. The fluffy cloud blends in with the images and helps to bind it all together. As the camera moves around, it's now genuinely moving through an atmospheric haze. The density I'll change down to 22, although this is up to you really. The cloud works so well, let's duplicate it, move it over to the right, and change the colour to match the more orangey glow of the nebula. It's a great contribution to the shot with pretty much zero effort, but don't tell anyone I said that. Now let's borrow a trick from space-based computer games and add some unrealistic space dust. Please note that these are not stars because that would be even more unrealistic and clearly ridiculous. The benefit of small particles is that they give the viewer more reference for the camera movement in what is otherwise a mostly empty void. To make the space dust, we'll use a very simple particle simulator. After dragging it on, change the emitter shape to cube. We want the dust to be emitted over the entire scene, so increase the width, height and depth until it covers the main area of the scene. Again, it's easier to see what's going on from the perspective view. For the particle system's appearance, we'll simply import the circle blur texture, which Josh created for his prism teleport tutorial a little while back. The important settings are in movement. We'll put the life up to 15 seconds, so that the dust lasts slightly longer than the shot itself. We don't want it vanishing halfway through. The scale needs to go way down to about 7%, as we want the space dust to be only barely visible. Most importantly, the speed should be set to 0. This means the space dust will be completely still, so that it gives an accurate reference for the movement of the camera to the viewer. In movement variation, let's change the scale variation to 3%, which will make sure the dust isn't all exactly the same size. We don't want new particles appearing throughout the shot, so go to frame 0 and in the general settings turn on keyframing for the active property by clicking the grey circle. It should turn green. Now move forward a single frame and uncheck the property so that the particle system is no longer active. No new particles will be created after the first frame. We'll increase the number of particles per second to 5,000. The actual number you go for will depend on the composition of the shot and the look you're going for. A slight problem here is that with particles only emitting on the first frame, we're not getting up to the full 5,000 particles, which is why you can't really see anything right now. To fix this, we'll go up to the effect's general properties and set the time shift to -1 second. This means that the particle simulation begins 1 second before the layer actually appears on the timeline, so that from the moment the space dust appears, there are already at least 5,000 particles. Because we've got our trajectory set to random, the particles now spawn at random within the cube shape, ensuring that they fill the entire scene. This same general technique can be used to create any kind of star field. Something that will really bring the original nebula image to life is if some of the stars become more dynamic. Adding a light flare is easy. You just create a plane or a grade layer, then drag the light flare on from the effects browser. However, because we're going to have a 3D camera move, it's important that the lens flares are positioned convincingly in 3D space. I'll just get rid of that light flare. Okay, to do this, we'll reuse a trick from some earlier videos. First, we'll add a new point layer. This can be positioned in 3D space to match a bright spot in the original image. Let's move it back to where the midground layer is, then in the active camera view, we'll line it up. It doesn't have to be too perfect. Points are only invisible references, of course. To have a visible star, we'll add a grade layer from the new layer menu, then drag a light flare from the effects browser onto it. The crucial thing now is to go to the light flare's hotspot position properties and assign it to star 1. The center property also needs to be set to 0, 0 so that it all aligns properly. This locks the light flare to the position of the 3D point, even though the light flare itself is a 2D effect. As the camera moves around, the light flare stays in its correct position in the nebula. The light flare can then be customized to get the right look. I went with the customized flashlight white flare, but really it's up to you. A light rays effect was also added to give the light flare some bloom as it moves past the center of frame. The shot now needs a bit of grading. Subtle alterations using the color correction wheels can shift the midtones towards red and drop the shadows towards blue. This creates a less saturated, more unified shot. Generous application of the crush black and whites effect enriches the shot, giving it a lot more punch and really helping to make the colors pop. Finally, a vignette helps to focus the viewer's eye towards the glowing center of the nebula. We'll just use the 720p preset here. The final step is to create the actual camera move. It's important to remember that we are limited a little by the setup of the background, which restricts how far we can pan around. This is why it's always worth knowing what kind of shot you're after before you start piecing it together in HitFilm. Make sure you design the effect around the shot you need to tell your story, not the other way around. As this is quite a simple shot, I simply enabled keyframing on all of the camera's transform properties, moved the camera to the start position on the first frame, which is a nice wide of the whole scene, and then moved forwards about 9 seconds and moved the camera to its end position. I also then added some additional orientation keyframes so that the camera twists around slightly as it changes position. This is of course just one example of a space scene. With the same techniques but a different background image, you can end up with very different results. You can even not bother with a background image at all and go with an entirely CG shot. If you're good with miniatures or with 3D modeling software, you can even start to composite in spaceships and other elements, but that's a tutorial for another time. Thanks for watching. Please do subscribe if you like these tutorials. We've got a whole bunch in the works, plus some cool short films coming up soon, so you can expect a lot of exciting stuff on the HitFilm channel. Any questions, you can always find us on our Facebook page, on Twitter, and of course on the hitfilm.com forums. We really hope to see you there. Thanks for watching.